So, good afternoon. Obviously, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which the Brisbane Convention and Exhibition Centre is built, and acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of land throughout Australia. I pay respect to them and their elders, past, present, and future. Thank you very much to the Asia Pacific Regional Internet Governance Forum and the team behind it for their tireless but essential work in convening and delivering this important forum. And thank you here in the room and online for joining us today in today's session, Stronger Together, Amplifying Multi-Stakeholder Voices in Cyber Diplomacy. It's a privilege to be among such a diverse group of stakeholders coming together to discuss and explore the critical intersection of cyber diplomacy and multi-stakeholder collaboration in today's rapidly evolving digital landscape. I am Michael Karimian, a director on Microsoft's digital diplomacy team. I'm based in Singapore, from where I work across Asia and the Pacific with governments, civil society, academia, industry to help advance responsible behavior in cyberspace. As we embark on this session, I think it's worth just firstly clarifying some fundamental concepts. Cyber diplomacy, sometimes referred to as digital diplomacy, encapsulates the efforts and negotiations undertaken by various stakeholders to address the complex and interconnected challenges emerging in cyberspace. Quite importantly, it involves discussions and actions aimed at establishing norms, rules, and agreements to ensure the peaceful and secure use of cyberspace, ideally on a global stage. Multi-stakeholderism, of course, embodies a collaborative approach involving governments, the private sector, civil society, academia, and technical communities in policy discussions and decision-making processes. That recognizes that the challenges and opportunities posed by, and sometimes within the digital realm, cannot be addressed effectively by any single entity or sector alone. Instead, by bringing together diverse perspectives, multi-stakeholderism should promote balanced, inclusive, and sustainable solutions to complex issues, as we've been discussing earlier today, and of course yesterday at NetThing as well. So why do we need cyber diplomacy or digital diplomacy? And why is multi-stakeholder collaboration crucial in this context? Well, as we start to embrace transformative technologies such as AI, 5G, or even 6G and blockchain, and in the not too distant future, quantum computing, the potential for innovation is enormous, but of course, so are the challenges. And with the increase in frequency and sophistication, cyber threats are transcending borders, they are targeting governments, industries, and individuals alike. These threats really can and already do disrupt economies, they compromise sensitive information, and in some circumstances, even threaten human lives. So addressing these challenges, of course, requires efforts that draw upon the expertise, resources, and insights of various stakeholders. Cyber diplomacy, in theory, seeks to mitigate risks and promote stability, ensuring that digital technologies serve as enablers of progress rather than a source of conflict. And this is where multi-stakeholder collaboration becomes indispensable. Now, the region here, the Asia Pacific region, of course, is characterized by its quite multifaceted diversity, including in its governance and social systems, as well as in its economic and social growth. But it is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of cyber threats and disruptions, but is often underrepresented in multi-stakeholder cyber diplomacy. Our session today will delve into the pressing need for enhanced cooperation within our region, examining the nuances and challenges that arise when we endeavor to amplify multi-stakeholder voices in cyber diplomacy. We will explore a number of examples of successful collaboration, as well as instances where inclusivity has been lacking. Now, as we proceed through our discussions, let's do keep in mind that the decisions and insights discussed here today have the potential to shape future of the digital ecosystem, and we will have a decent amount of time for an interactive Q&A. I really do encourage you all to actively participate and share your experiences, insights, and perspectives. So let us embark on this journey together. And firstly, I will introduce our wonderful, wonderful panelists. Firstly, the hardest working panelist here at NetThing and the Asia Pacific Regional IGF, it's Johanna Weaver, the founding director of the Tech Policy Design Centre, TPDC, at Australian National University. Also here in person, and as a last-minute stand-in, Brett Solomon, Executive Director of Access Now. We were due to be joined by a colleague of Brett's who's going to join us online, but the Amtrak system in the US had other plans, and instead his train was cancelled. But it is a very nice treat to be joined by Brett, who Brett and I have worked together for a number of years, but of course, because of other factors, haven't seen each other for a while. Johanna and Brett know each other for a long time, and even though both based here in Australia, this is actually their first time meeting. And then joining us online from the city that never sleeps is the Australian civil servant who never sleeps. Briony Daley Whitworth, who is looming over us quite appropriately, like the Wizard of Oz, is the director in the Cyber Affairs branch of the Australian Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade. So with that, let's begin. Johanna, drawing on your experiences in cyber diplomacy and work at ANU's Tech Policy Design Center, how do you perceive the current state of multi-stakeholder collaboration in the region, specifically concerning cybersecurity challenges?
So we've learned earlier that I'm always an optimist. So let me focus on the positives. I think we've seen a lot of really positive developments in cyber diplomacy and therefore looking at the impact of that on cybersecurity in the last, let's say, 10 years. We've gone from a period of time where we didn't have governments who had cyber ambassadors or nominated representatives that recognize that this issue is an issue that is just important to our national security and our economies, to having almost every government in our region now having a representative within government focused on these issues. Now, we can have a conversation, and I hope we have a conversation about how effective that representation is, and also, one of the concerns that I have about a lot of those positions is that they still overly focus on the security elements rather than the development and the economic aspects. But I think we have come a long way in that short period of time. I think when we move beyond looking at government-to-government cooperation, when we look at engagement and the multi-stakeholder community in our region, we can definitely say positive developments around the way that governments are interacting with each other. We now have, for example, the Singapore International Cyber Week, which is, a really leading initiative. You have Singapore leading the open-ended working group, which is one of the most important discussions about the future of international security and cyberspace. So we have governments stepping up. And what I don't see as much is forums and opportunities for the multi-stakeholder community to engage in those discussions as much as we would like to see. And I say that with full acknowledgement of the fact that people like Brett have been doing incredible work in this space for a long time, but also many others in the room. I see Bart Hogevarden, who is from ASPI, who's been doing excellent work, Sherry from Fiji, who's been doing excellent work in this space. So I think what I would like to see having greater engagement and greater connectivity is bringing together the success that we've had in galvanizing government focus on this issue, that it's now a priority for government, but then having government value more the input from the multi-stakeholder community. And I say that with full acknowledgement as someone who used to work for government, and that having that input and engagement of the multi-stakeholder community is something that we need to value more.
Thank you, Johanna. Now, Briony is normally based in Canberra. I should say rarely based in Canberra since she's on the road so much. Briony, I hope all your houseplants are made of plastic. The reason you're joining us online from New York is because you're participating in the ad hoc committee process on cybercrime to elaborate a cybercrime convention. It is fair to say that Australia has been actively involved in UN and regional processes, including the ASEAN Regional Forum. So from your perspective, how has the multi-stakeholder engagement contributed to shaping cyber policies and practices in the region?
And can I just say, Briony has the most impressive houseplants of anyone I have ever met.
Thank you so much, Michael and Johanna. I also have a delightful husband who waters my houseplants when I'm out of town. It's lovely to join you all, despite the fact that I am in New York. I'm joining you from the trenches. It's very intense here at the moment, negotiating a cybercrime convention for those who are not following those processes in as much detail as some of our wonderful multi-stakeholders. I think from the question posed, one thing that I have definitely noticed in regards to the stakeholders, and particularly in our region, is that you really get out of it what you put in. We have seen a few stakeholders who have become incredibly well respected and have become really big players in the region. And that's because they have invested, and it's not money I'm talking about, it's time, it's relationships, and it's building trust. and also proving that they are here to provide substantive advice rather than play a political game. And that really does foster the trust of countries so that they begin to trust stakeholders. And we've seen this work particularly well because it's no surprise that the region that we are operating in is a contested region at the moment. And many countries in our region, independence and sovereign decision-making and sovereign choices is absolutely key for these countries. Particularly when it comes to deciding their own digital futures. And so the way that I have seen stakeholders engage with countries so that they are asking, what do you want? How do you want to get there? Rather than dictating or making assumptions on these questions really does have an effect in the way that builds trust. And shows that stakeholders are really trying to work within a regional and a domestic context rather than trying to impose models from elsewhere. And we've seen this breed success. I've seen this work fantastically in the way that the norms of responsible state behaviour, which were agreed by the UN Group of Government Experts in 2015 and reaffirmed by all 193 member states in 2021, which Johanna was the leader of our Australian delegation to. The way that these have been adopted, endorsed, and then really focused on the implementation of these norms in the ASEAN region in particular, through the work of ASPI, through the work of the ASEAN Regional Forum and the AMCC, the ASEAN Ministerial Cyber Conference, has been fantastic to see the way that stakeholders have been able to engage both in determining how best practice these norms may be implemented, but also working with countries on the way that these can be implemented domestically, and turned into something that is now a chair of the new OEWG, who is Singapore's proposal to create checklists of basic the low level, exactly what countries need to do to create their implementation of the norms. And the fact that that has gone from a multi-stakeholder proposal in a couple of ASEAN countries to something that has made its way through to ASEAN itself, and then to the ARF, and now to the UN Open-Ended Working Group, shows that a stakeholder and a group of stakeholders can really have an effect over time if they build that trust. And the second example I have is the capacity building principles. And Johanna, I'm really glad you brought up development, because development is such a key issue for this region. And several years ago, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise developed a set of principles for cyber capacity building. And they drew this from the Addis Agenda. And then those capacity building principles were advocated for by many stakeholders in the UN, and then also by member states, so that they were adopted by the Open-Ended Working Group in 2021, and now they have become ubiquitous. So we're seeing them pop up everywhere. We're seeing states negotiating a UN Convention on Cybercrime now promoting the capacity building principles that were agreed by a group of stakeholders several years ago as something that would be legally binding potentially in a convention. So that's another example of where we've seen stakeholders contributing to shaping the UN processes.
Thank you, Briony. And those capacity building principles that you mentioned from the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise, the GFC, they are worth looking at if you hadn't had a chance to yet, because I think there's a lot of applicability in capacity building across digital issues, not just within cybersecurity. And actually Chatham House is now working on a guide for implementing those principles. So we'll see how those principles kind of continue to live going forward. Briony is in New York at the moment for 2 weeks, although the ad hoc committee process is generally in Vienna. Johanna, you mentioned Singapore International Cyber Week. That will be immediately after the IGF in Kyoto. These four convenings point to the challenge that many participants have of A, there's a lot of them, and B, they can be in far-flung, expensive places. And in a world where everyone has stretched resources, that's a challenge. If anyone knows about stretched resources, it's Access Now. So Brett, Access Now has really been at the forefront of protecting open internet and user rights across the region, although it is actually a global organization, it works around the world. What do you think have been some of the key challenges and successes engaging governments, industry, and civil society to advance multi-stakeholder cybersecurity and non-cybersecurity initiatives?
Thanks. Is this mic on? Yes, it is. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. No. I'm getting mixed messages from the audience. Some of you are saying yes and some of you are saying no. I'm just going to keep talking. I'll start talking anyway. Thanks so much. And I'm disappointed that my colleague Raman, who lives and breathes the issue of civil society participation in cyber issues and cyber diplomacy is not here. As you say, there's an Amtrak issue happening, which somebody who's traveled between New York and DC many times has experienced that personally. So I understand. This issue of participation in processes is obviously absolutely critical. I think that history is made by people who attend meetings, unfortunately, and it is true to say that. It is true to say that civil society actors, despite even best interests and skills and knowledge, are often not part of the process. And that's, and I see a lot of civil society folks nodding, that is very true and very real. And there's so many elements that are attached to that. And unfortunately, the onus seems to fall back on us to be there and to be present and to be able to hop between the four venues that you identified, but in fact, the venues are much more significant, they are present in so many different spaces that you need to be at, whether it be national or regional or global or within civil society. Obviously, that makes our ability to be able to influence and shape the future more and more difficult. And I think as cyber diplomacy and cyber security and all the things that sort of make up the ecosystem become more prevalent in our lives and more impactful in our lives, we would want to see the necessary commensurate growth of civil society. And unfortunately, I don't see that, which is really unfortunate. In fact, I was mentioning to Michael when he was cajoling me to join, no, he wasn't, to come and sit on the panel, but, is the fact that I think civil society across this region, and I'm Australian and also conscious that there's a very Australian heavy contingent on this panel. And I think when we talk about Asia Pacific region, it's absolutely essential. Again, a shame that Raman is not here, but absolutely essential to ensure that people on the panels are also reflective of the audience and reflective of the conversation. To get back to basics, I think some of us who maybe are newer in this space haven't actually acknowledged or don't necessarily know the history all the way back from the World Summit on Information Society back in 2005, which actually mandates that civil society is an equal participant in these discussions. Like, it's not something that we should have to ask for or request. It's actually something that is in the framework from the beginnings of the internet, from the beginnings of governance of the internet. And I often say that to my team. It's like, we don't need to ask. Like, our right is already mandated, and it's about enjoying that right. Of course, there are lots of practical limitations, as I mentioned. I want to just touch on two. One is the issue of visas. And I know that this is a perennial kind of ongoing issue, but it's actually getting worse. And that is making sure that people are actually able to get into the countries where the meetings are taking place. I think many people in the global north take this for granted. Folks in the global majority do not. Again, I can see quite a lot of nodding in the audience. This is a real issue, and it is the responsibility of the governments or the intergovernmental organisation, the conveners, to actually really take this very seriously and make sure that people are able to sit in the room. And we experienced that at RightsCon, and which we organised in Costa Rica this year, and made some mistakes on that front. I think we didn't put enough energy as a civil society actor into making sure that other civil society actors were in the room. And the second thing is that a lot of the processes are UN mandated, and which means that for some of them, you need to have ECOSOC status, which is status with the NGO committee. And we ourselves, Access Now, spent 4 years at that committee arguing for our ECOSOC status so that we could have the right to enter meetings. And we got it. But I feel like that kind of door is also closing as well, which means that, you know, you need to find other civil society organizations who have got that kind of status to be able to convey your messages. Yeah, so maybe I'll just stop there.
Really great perspectives, and important to hear the challenges that civil society face in this region and around the world. I'm not in any way going to try to compare the experience of civil society with industry, but what's interesting as well is that in these processes, there's also an underrepresentation of industry globally, but especially from this region. We really do not see companies from this region participate in these processes. Partly that can be a matter of awareness, partly it can be a matter of the companies not having sufficient public policy capacity within themselves. Also, sometimes it's a lack of invitation to the table. To your point, Brett, about how you have to be in the meeting to actually shape these things, companies in this region just often aren't invited. Obviously the shift over the last couple of years towards hybrid formats has been helpful, but the tyranny of time zones is very much a detriment to this region in particular, and that is often not addressed as much as it needs to be. I see Briony nodding. I know Briony is on the receiving end of that to a tremendous extent. Now, in terms of the challenges that we can look forward to, we've already discussed a lot of the challenges that exist now, but Johanna, I'm intrigued as we begin to think about the rise of AI, 5G, 6G, blockchain, you name it. What do you see as being some of the key obstacles in achieving more and inclusive, effective multi-stakeholder cooperation in addressing the emerging cybersecurity threats?
Yeah, so I'll share a little tip that I have on time zones. So I often have requests to speak, and I have a rule now in my team that if the request to speak does not translate the time into Australian Eastern Standard Time, we don't respond to the request because of exactly what you're talking about. The continued participation and the dependence, particularly for countries in our region, and it's always in the middle of the night very often. And if people don't have the courtesy to understand that they're asking me to speak at 11 p.m. or 2 p.m. or 3 p.m., I'm not prepared to engage. I encourage others to take on that policy as well. I think when we come to looking at emerging technologies, the first thing also, and this is really to Brett's point around the participation in UN processes and the risk of being excluded from those UN processes. I think another elephant in the room around that is that there are countries who actively don't want multi-stakeholder participation in these processes, who have a veto right effectively, because the processes, when you're talking within the United Nations, operate on a consensus basis. And so if there is objections, then they can do that, and they can often do it without the countries being named. And, you know, I think that is something that is really detrimental. It's not always that you don't have an invitation to the table as civil society. It's that invitation is actively being blocked by countries who don't want to hear those voices. With respect to AI, 5G, blockchain, I actually think in part there will be more invitations to the table by civil society, by industry, because these are areas, or more invitations by government, for example, to industry and civil society, because there is a genuine acknowledgement of the fact that government doesn't necessarily understand this tech. I don't engage with, I can't recall one conversation with government where they haven't actually been open about that. So I think part of the challenge is about understanding the pathways and being clear about, you know, is this an internet governance conversation? Is this a cybersecurity conversation? And if we're talking about cybersecurity, are we talking about cybersecurity in the context of international security, war and peace issues, or are we talking about technical cybersecurity? Because different actors need to be at the table for all of those different types of discussions. So I think, you know, it's incumbent on all of us to be asking those questions to make sure that we have the right people at the table. I think there will be much more appetite to have civil society and industry engaged in those discussions. I also couldn't echo more Brett's comment about we need to actively foster civil society's participation in our region. If you look at other regions in the world, there are many think tanks working on these types of issues. In our region, there is 1 or 2 think tanks that are working on these issues. If we want to increase the quality of the contribution and to increase the voices and to ensure that our region's view is heard and respected, we really need to be supporting those who are engaging. And we can all think off the top of our heads of 4 or 5 people who are called on always to speak on these issues, who speak about the challenges that they have of getting traction within their own organisations to be working on these issues. So, there's a funding issue, there's a priority issue there as well.
Johanna, you mentioned the objections that can sometimes block civil society organizations from participating in processes. Brett, you mentioned something similar. This happens in industry too. One practical solution to that, or one potential workaround, is that sometimes national delegations, depending on the process, can invite outside stakeholders to join as experts. And just to give crystal clear examples of that, at Microsoft, we benefited from the US Council for International Business doing that, as well as the US UN permanent mission as well. And definitely encourage other nation state delegations to do the same. I know a number of them have done so elsewhere. I'll ask a couple more questions to the panelists and then open up for audience questions. So do please start to think as to what you would like to ask our expert panelists about. But Briony, in your view, what steps can be taken to enhance the value of multi-stakeholderism within regional or even global architecture and enhance the role of stakeholders in regional cybersecurity and again, maybe global cybersecurity initiatives and collaborative cyber diplomacy efforts? And I encourage you to put your modesty to one side and mention the work of the Women in Cyber Fellowship and the way in which that has benefited from multi-stakeholder input in some of its trainings.
Thank you so much for that prompt. I will add Women in Cyber to my list of things to mention. I'm also missing Raman here. He promised me an office that we could both join from New York, and here I am in my hotel room instead. So, but I think the one thing that I would say to all stakeholders, if you want to be involved in these processes, coordinate with each other, coordinate. These things are really detailed. They are really hard to follow. I have a team of 6 people helping me as a smallish country following all of these processes. And that's our day job. That's our job. Whereas I know this is something that a lot of you do out of the goodness of your hearts. And I really see the impact of the statements and of the contributions of stakeholders. They are directly correlated to the relevance of the discussions in which they are being provided. So if countries have been talking about critical infrastructure all morning and a stakeholder is joining and they start talking about something completely different like human rights, the impact is not as great as if you are actually responding to the discussion in the room in these processes. And we've seen the benefit of coordination. I talk to a lot of stakeholders in the room and they say, we are going to focus only on ransomware, and then we're going to let this other stakeholder focus on human rights, and then this other stakeholder will focus on critical infrastructure, and this other stakeholder will focus on protection of penetration testers and cybersecurity researchers, because most of the time stakeholders only get 3 minutes, and it's not the best modality, but it gives a little bit of a prompt to make sure that you have one message and you deliver it in the time that you have, and you coordinate to make sure that every message that you need is provided across the breadth of the stakeholders. And I've seen that work really, really well in the UN in particular during those very difficult modalities discussions. The other thing that has been raised by everyone in the room is the issue of how to participate. Being physically in person in the room is always a preference, but it is difficult. I know I'm often traveling, and it is difficult and it is time consuming. But if you are participating virtually, I think it's really helpful to have a written position as well, and particularly if these are provided early in the process. Not to speak out of turn or admit to anything that I wouldn't admit to, but I have plagiarized many stakeholder submissions when I've come to writing my interventions and realized that I actually have no idea what I'm about to say in 6 minutes. And so I have to go back and look at what some of the stakeholders have sent me. And it's often really, really helpful. So if you send your positions to countries, if you put them up on the websites, if you submit them, I promise you we read them. And you'll often hear many of us who may not have had enough time to do our own homework sometimes plagiarize those. So it can be very worthwhile. Johanna mentioned modalities of some of these processes, and I will admit they are incredibly difficult sometimes to work out participation of stakeholders. I have spent 9 months of my life negotiating multi-stakeholder modalities for one UN process and 6 months negotiating modalities for another. It is not something I ever want to do again, but we do it because it is so important to us to make sure that we get the voices in the room that we need to have in the room, because as has been said, we are not the experts. Many states are not the experts on so many of these issues, and we really do need the expert voices there. I've seen the way that industry and the technical community address the threat posed by malicious cyber activity really land in the open-ended working group on responsible state behaviour in particular, because they have first-hand experience as usually the owners of critical infrastructure and the controllers of critical infrastructure, first-hand experience on exactly what it means to be under cyber threat and under attack. I think the point that Michael makes on joining delegations is a good one. Australia has invited several stakeholders to join our delegations to various processes when they have been vetoed by other countries. However, I think that this is a band-aid. It's not a real fix. We do need to be fixing the process in its entirety and making sure that either the ECOSOC accreditation process becomes more streamlined and easier for those stakeholders in the tech and the cyber and the internet community to be able to become ECOSOC accredited, because ECOSOC is not currently sort of working in the tech space. They're very much looking much more at the sort of human rights and social space. So this is a new area for them. Or we make sure that we are working across all of these processes to have the best modalities for stakeholder engagement that we can. And that includes having those countries who may veto stakeholders being named. And that's something that we have in the new open-ended working group, which has been used to some effect. And also having the ability to review any vetoes, which is something that we have in the Cybercrime Convention negotiations as well. So if a country raises an objection, then that can in fact be overruled by a vote of 2/3 majority there. Finally, you wanted me to talk about the Women in Cyber program, which is my baby. So in 2020, actually 2019, Johanna on the panel here said, Briony, create a Women in Cyber Fellowship. And I said, oh, okay, great. What will we do with that? And we have pulled together a group of donor countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the UK, the US, and the Netherlands, who fund the travel and skills training of women delegates, usually from their foreign affairs ministries, but also sometimes from the technical community, from communications ministries, and from cybersecurity agencies, to come to New York to participate in these negotiations and provide them with the networking and also the negotiation skills necessary to participate effectively in those negotiations. And this has only been possible because we work so closely with several stakeholders. We have the GFCE, Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, who does a lot of the logistics on this for us, because most of us who work on this are policy people, not development people, from the donor countries. We have UNITAR, which is the United Nations Institute on Training, and they provide a lot of the skills-based negotiations training. And then we also make sure that we are providing the cyber policy expertise that these delegates may need to engage fulsomely in these conversations. So we work with Cyber Law International to provide the very objective workshops and development on international law in cyberspace. We work with UNIDIR, the United Nations Institute on Disarmament Research, to provide further information on how other aspects of international peace and security work with cyberspace, and several other stakeholders will bring in. So Microsoft has presented on our panels. We've had CSIS, the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. We've had the Stimson Centre. We've had WILF. We work with a whole range of stakeholders to really pull together a program here. And one of my proudest moments was last year. The reason that we pulled together this fellowship in the first place is because in the UN disarmament discussions, which happen in the UN First Committee, generally you have about 30% of delegates and speakers are women. And then when this becomes more technical, these groups, it goes down to about 23%, and cyber is considered one of the more technical aspects. And since we've created the Women in Cyber Fellowship, we have seen an astronomical leap in the way that women are represented in First Committee cyber discussions. We had from February 2020, 35% of interventions were made by women. And then in the new open-ended working group, every single meeting has had over 45% of interventions made by women. And last year, we finally reached gender parity with 51% of interventions in that process being made by women delegates in relation to international law and capacity building, which is pretty phenomenal. And the reason it matters is, and I always quote Under Secretary General Izumi Nakamitsu at this point, because when she launched the Women in Cyber Fellowship, she told all the women around the table that in her experience and through the research, peace deals stick better and last longer when you have women at the table. And we have seen the progress that can be made in the open-ended working group and in UN discussions absolutely impacted by the fact that we have women in the room. And that's because of not only the donors, it's because of the actual women, and it's because of the stakeholders and all the contributions that are made towards that program.
It is phenomenal, really, really is phenomenal. Gender parity in participation and representation doesn't just happen organically. It does require this exact type of affirmative intervention that the Women in Cyber program has been able to achieve. And so huge kudos to Johanna for the idea, and Briony and the team for their incredible efforts in making that happen. Briony mentioned the importance of coordination in these processes. And Brett, yesterday in one of the sessions, we were reminded of the so-called CIA principles in cybersecurity: confidentiality of systems, integrity of systems, and availability of systems. On the point of coordination, Access Now has done a tremendous job in its keeping the lights on initiative to help to push back against network shutdowns around the world. as you think about that example and others, how can industry and civil society better collaborate and build alliances to advocate for more systemic and meaningful inclusion of multi-stakeholder voices, either in cyber diplomacy or elsewhere?
Thanks a lot. Briony, congratulations on the network and the initiative on trying to get gender parity in cyber communications and cyber policy. I think that it's absolutely essential. And as you say, you know, it's not just window dressing, or what I take away from it's not just window dressing. It's about how do you actually get better policy. And it's the same thing when I think about civil society as well, because we're on the front lines of cybersecurity attacks. Like, we see cyber threats, I think, earlier than many companies and many governments, or at least the things that we see uniquely. And so in order to think about the whole ecosystem, it's much better to have input from all of the players, including us. And I just don't think that happens. You know, Access Now does digital security provision through the Digital Security Helpline, and there are many civil society actors who do as well. So we see the attacks in real time, and we see the nature of them, and we see the trends as well. It means we can provide analysis and escalation. We're part of FIRST, which is the Federal Forum of so it's basically security incident response team. So many companies, including Microsoft, I believe, is a member of FIRST. Access Now is the first civil society member of FIRST, which means that we can actually provide information to the security community and also receive information as well, because not only are we often the first to see it, but we're also the ones who experience it with the least level of protection. With the least level of protection, I'll say that again, like most civil society actors are under significant attack, whether it be from malware or spyware or DDoS attacks, etc. So that we actually see the threats, we experience it firsthand, which means across all issues, the affected populations are often the best or need to be in the room to define and determine the solutions. Briony, I hope when you're plagiarizing some of the reports that you receive and you know, provide them as official government policy, that you're looking at our reports that in our interventions. We did just do an intervention. Raman just did an intervention on Friday on the cyber crime treaty. And basically, when we think about better policy, better practice, like, it is true that many governments see cybersecurity researchers and analysts as the part of the opposition. You know, they see them as a problem. So trying to get onto a delegation is very, very problematic. And that's why it's so important to, or even just to have a seat at the table. We've seen many security researchers who have been arrested. Olabini is an example who just got released. Security researchers who are trying to provide input, advice, etc. And the cybercrime treaty that's been negotiated is at risk of actually criminalising those security researchers. So that was one thing that was part of our representation that we made on Friday in New York at the ad hoc committee. And absolutely essential to ensure that civil society is at the table to protect other parts of civil society, and in order to get better cybersecurity outcomes or cybercrime outcomes in this instance. There's one other issue that I wanted to mention, and I'm not exactly sure if I'm answering your question, but which is around encryption, which is another issue that is extremely important in this area of cyber security and cyber diplomacy. And there is a real, as many of you would know, attack on encryption, that encryption is actually the pathway to insecurity, that, you know, encryption hides terrorists and criminal behavior, etc. We actually see it as the opposite, that security is the pathway. Encryption is the pathway to security. And I think it's essential that governments hear that, and industry players hear that as well. And many industry players have also obviously advocates of strong encryption. On the issue of internet shutdowns, it's true, we're the lead agency on internet shutdowns. We run the Keep It On Coalition. It's about 300 NGOs, and we put out an annual report on shutdowns that take place. But we also work very closely with partners all around the world to respond in real time to shutdowns that are happening. And I have to say that the only times that we've really been successful, and I wonder if my Keep It On team will agree with this, but is when we work in coalition. And when I say successful, I mean successful in actually stopping an internet shutdown from happening before it happens. So there's intentional disruptions of the network. When we can get some champions from the government, some regulators, some companies and other members of civil society to sit down before an election or before whatever it is the moment that we think a shutdown is going to happen and work together, we can actually name it, shape it and prevent it from happening. And I think that's a really beautiful example, a practical example of how multi-stakeholderism can work in practice.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And of course, the Keep It On Coalition and the work they have done, there's a lot of information online. I do encourage you to check it out. Pushing back against network shutdowns is important to ensuring cybersecurity of individuals and systems worldwide. And it's a scourge and definitely antithetical to our human rights. So I really commend the work of Access Now and its partners in that space. We now have approximately 12 minutes remaining, and that time is dedicated to interactive Q&A. Admittedly, that is less than we had originally scheduled. That's my own fault. No, not at all. But it's important that we hear from a variety of audience members and that you'll have a chance to participate. So if you're able to, please come to the microphone at the stand. Otherwise, please raise a hand if you can, and a microphone will be brought to you. Jasmine is roaming the room with a microphone now. Thank you very much, Jasmine. And it'll be good to take 2 or 3 questions together. If you could please begin, if you wish to, by identifying who you are and who you represent. That'll be wonderful.
My name's Paul Toomey. I have multiple personality disorder. So I'll say I used to be a CEO of ICAN. That'll be the context. Just comment to the Australians, I suppose, in the panel, and then a general comment to the whole panel. One of the things that my experience in trying to get multi-stakeholders accepted in WSIS and WICET and all manner of things, and APEC, TELMIN, etc., over many years, there's been a tendency recently to see multi-stakeholderism equals Silicon Valley equals the interest of the United States production side. And that's a pitch made by a lot of state capitalists and others. I wonder, the experience of the Australians for the last 150 years as being one of the fast adopters of technology. If you look at it, it's mostly been a multi-stakeholder arrangement in Australia from the telegraph onwards. And I wonder if, and probably true for other parts of the region, you talked this morning about different regional stories, regional narratives. To what degree can we give a regional narrative which says, you know, we're not a production company. There's a bunch of us who are price takers in the technology space. We're one of them. Nevertheless, we want multi-stakeholderism because our experience is that accelerates uptake and effective uptake. And I wonder if there's a different way of positioning multi-stakeholder such that the people who don't want it at all can't simply say this represents the interests of the large companies in Silicon Valley. So that's one question. And then the second question I have for those who are talking on this agenda, we fought intensely hard in WSIS, not just for civil society, which exists in the UN system, but for the technical bodies to be recognized as their own set of entities. The present wording for the stuff around the Global Digital Compact seems to ignore all of that. So what are each of you doing to send a message to our friends in UN, particularly the Secretary Generals, who in my experience are always sensitive to criticism, to say the present model just don't work?
Great first question. Thank you very much. We have another question lined up.
Good morning. My name is Chat Garcia Ramilo. I'm the Executive Director of the Association for Progressive Communications. I want to just share one example also of how we participate in multi-stake and maybe I believe strengthen the multi-stakeholder space, and specifically in relation to cybersecurity. So one of the things we do have access to the open-ended working group, but we focus very specifically, our focus has been on developing a gender responsive cybersecurity policy. So I think one of the things that I just want to say about how important, I guess, the effectiveness of participating in spaces that are not as accessible to many. And we take that responsibility of bringing that back to the community quite seriously, is to really focus on what it is that's missing. And I think one of the things that we've seen is that what was the missing part is the framework. How do you define cybersecurity? And I think one of the things we provide here is that, one, you look at the context of what Brett has been saying, that we actually see what is missing and what the context is and what the threats are. And in the definition of cybersecurity, it needs to be much more, it needs to be broader, and it has to speak to the experiences of people on the ground. I think the second thing here is that to then be able to develop tools and to connect that with people who are actually on the ground. So one of the things we've done here is, and in fact, we have tomorrow a session on how do you develop a gender responsive cybersecurity policy. And we've gone around, had sessions, have had research, and talked to people, both from civil society as well as from policymakers, to ask them specifically, how do you actually talk about cybersecurity and how is that relevant to you? So I think the participation is not, yes, it's important to be in those sessions, and we try to be with the limited resources we have, try to be in those sessions, but at the same time, the responsibility of definitely bringing that back and then bringing it upwards again. So I think that is really important. And I invite you tomorrow to that session that on cybersecurity policy and a gender responsive cybersecurity policy. That's at 11:30 tomorrow. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I think there's a third question.
Sorry to jump in. Actually, we have a question from the local hub too. So they're joining all the way, few hours, time zone away from UITS. So Safire, Mr. Safire, would you be able to unmute yourself to ask the question, please?
Yes. Good morning. Good morning here from University of Information Technology and Sciences, Bangladesh. We are glad to be a local hub in the Asia Pacific Regional Internet Governance Forum 2023. Here we are gathered, our Honorable Dean, Faculty of Science and Engineering, heads of the departments, and distinguished faculty members from different departments participated in today's session as a local hub participants. And here you also see that there is gender, 50-50, men's and women's, they are interested about the cybersecurities and the emerging technologies as well. I have only two questions in this early morning. First of all, we are from the academia stakeholders community. So what are the skill sets required for the upcoming trends and the emerging technologies, faculty's research and skill sets? This is my first question. And second one, how about the cybersecurity diplomacy and policies? Our country yesterday, the cabinet ministry finalized the cybersecurity laws in 2023. So these laws we need to mitigate and work together with the working group of APrIGF 2023. How the academia and the multi-stakeholders from Bangladesh can work with the working groups of APrIGF 2023 to elaborate, to explain the more policy that we need for the future upcoming events. Thank you.
Wonderful. So we have 4.5 minutes remaining. So I will ask that, Edmund, do you have a hand?
There are two more hands over here, but I don't know whether you want to respond first or take both of them.
If they can be very quick, succinct questions, that would be wonderful.
It's up to you. I'll be quick. Yeah, I'll be quick. Hello, my name is Gunilla Asbrink from the Internet Society Accessibility Standing Group, and we're talking about civil society and participation. And we know that people with disabilities form about 15 to 20% of the world's population. And we really do need to have mechanisms to ensure that people with disabilities are participating in these discussions
in this room, in other rooms on a global basis. And there's funding issues, there's awareness raising needed to have that particular experience from people with disability. Nothing about us without us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's good afternoon. Yeah, good, because I'm carrying my Indian watch, so I haven't changed my time. So I represent India. I'm from India. My name is Saeed Qazi. So we work in the space of technology and society for the last 20 years in India. So I just wanted to share two things. One is based on our recent work and experiences in the space of increasing cyber crimes against women, and also this internet shutdowns that is happening in India. And recently, I think many of you are aware that in the state of Manipur, it has been quite prolonged internet shutdowns, I think in one of the longest in the world, maybe perhaps. So we have been trying to focus on these issues for the last 2-3 years. And one challenge that we're facing is to mobilize voices from the community, from the civil society, as well as from the media, local media, the national media, on these issues of that requires a lot of cyber diplomatic engagement with the government. So that is one question. It's not a question, but an observation that how to deal with this kind of situations where you don't have enough voices from the civil society and for the media also. So what to be done in this context, especially in the global South? So second question is in terms of the response from the system. Because in our recent experiences, when we mobilize, when we write, when we engage the government, perhaps it's the lack of the capacity or the processes that are already been talked about, but also the response coming from the system, from the government or the agencies which are responsible to listen and also engage in these processes. So these are quite a tough nut to crack. So that is the kind of challenges also we constantly face in terms of engaging the agencies responsible. And also not having enough techno-legal capacities and expertise in these agencies or people around who can be part of this ecosystem or engaging the diplomatic ecosystem. That is very, very important.
Thank you. So the APrIGF team is lovely and very collegiate, but I know we have less than a minute to go and they are ruthless with time.
Actually, I have one last important question because it's from our remote fellow who cannot come to Australia because of visa rejection. But then he has a question, Namka from Bhutan. I'm going to ask for him. So he's asking, what is your opinion about some groups having more resources, influences, and access to participate actively, leading to imbalances in decision making? That's his question. Thank you.
So recognizing that we are at the end of time and that it's important everyone has a chance in the room to grab lunch and Briony to go to bed at 11 p.m. New York time, what I recommend, I'll take a chair prerogative here, is that we acknowledge those questions as statements of problem, which they absolutely are. And I think I can channel the mindset of the fellow panelists and just recognize that that's probably the perspective that you would have in response to the very valuable questions raised, that these are challenges to continue to be tackled. With that in mind, there will be a session on this topic and similar topics at the Global IGF in Kyoto. So if you're able to join, please do so to help continue the conversation. Thank you again to our panelists, Johanna Weaver, Brett Solomon for diving in at the last minute, Briony, Daley, Whitworth for staying up so late where you are, and thank you all here in the room and joining online for your excellent contributions today. Thank you.